Good morning and welcome to your early morning briefing for Wednesday, the 29th of January, 2025. I'm your host, Mark Nielsen, and I am joined by the team, Jared, Robert, and Mike Shelby. All right, let's jump inside the Beltway. Robert, it looks like the White House gave us an update regarding those New Jersey drones that were flying overhead and caused a lot of public outcry. Could you give us an update there?
Good morning, Mark. Yes, so White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said that these drones that were reported flying over New Jersey starting in November of last year were actually authorized by the Federal Aviation Administration for research and some other purposes. She also said a lot of these were also hobbyists that were known to the FAA.
All right, moving on. It looks like also, Robert, that the new Transportation Secretary has directed the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to now review some emission standards. What's going on?
Yeah, this is Trump's new Transportation Secretary, Sean Duffy. He directed the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to review and reconsider what are called corporate average fuel economy standards for all vehicles produced from 2022 and onward. And this is, the fuel economy standards that basically mean you can't buy these, $10,000 Toyota Hilux trucks that are available overseas.
Okay, so and Jared, I'm a big Toyota Hilux respecter. Have we seen any indication that some of these vehicles that many of us are interested in, has there been any talks that this could affect that, or right now are we just talking about strict fuel emission standards?
Well, I think right now this is very early. It's too early to tell how this is going to impact, the ability to import those types of vehicles and some of these cheaper vehicles. But there has been some speculation that the point of this review is to lower prices for vehicles for Americans.
Excellent. Okay. And then finally, Robert, to wrap things up for Inside the Beltway, it looks like Panama is now launching an audit into the Chinese company which manages the Panama Canal. What's going on there?
Yeah, this was during a Senate hearing on the Panama Canal yesterday, and Federal Maritime Commissioner Daniel Maffei said that the Panamanian government is actually launching an audit into some of these apparently no-bid 25-year contracts into a Chinese company called Hutchison Ports that has a contract to run the ports at either end of the canal, and you can see in the Balboa and the Cristobal ports at either end. And this was part of the previous Panamanian administration. And Professor Eugene Kontorovich, he's a professor at the Scalia Law School, said that China could use this port contract from Hutchison Ports and a lot of the infrastructure around it to disrupt U.S. access to the Panama Canal. Something else that struck out to me interestingly is, well, one, I think that this is another part of Panama kind of giving into this pressure campaign from the Trump administration. We reported earlier that they had reached out to get lobbying services from a group that has direct ties to President Trump and Republicans. But I think there's also, Trump not ruling out military intervention prior to the inauguration was another part of this pressure campaign. And Kontorovich pointed out during this hearing that the neutrality treaty between Panama and the United States actually does allow the U.S. to take preemptive military action in the face of a credible threat to U.S. access.
All right, Robert, just to provide some perspective here. So, why now are we seeing this? And then also, when we look at the impact, what would be the impact that Trump is trying to mitigate here? I guess the risk he's trying to mitigate with the Panama Canal.
Well, I think why now is because we're seeing a lot of this ramping up of tariff threats from the Trump administration and responses from China. And, we're seeing this potential U.S.-China trade war ramping up. And some of the risks around here is it's not just access to the canal. There's also a lot of telecoms infrastructure being built in Latin America and Panama as well. And it's a lot of Huawei telecoms infrastructure that could be used for things like cyber attacks on U.S. vessels as they transit the canal or go around Latin America. I think the timing of this audit is an indicator of how effective the Trump pressure campaign has been, because this audit was actually launched the day after Trump's inauguration.
Right. And Robert, we were talking about this before the show that, the use of military force, that's a pretty big escalatory action. As I understand it, Trump has not said he has any plans to do that, but he's left it on the table. So do you feel like this is a major part of the kind of the change in tone coming from Panama, that at the very least, this is something that's on the table?
Yeah, I haven't seen any specific plans. Like the Trump administration hasn't said they're going to invade Panama or anything like that. But yeah, this does leave that option on the table, and I think that's part of why Panama is now, the comptroller and their government is starting this audit, because this is apparently an option that is open to the United States according to the treaty, where they can take preemptive military action. They don't have to wait for some type of military threat in the canal.
Okay, thanks, Robert. All right, and finally, to wrap things up for Inside the Beltway, we don't have anything significant to report in terms of hearings. There are several confirmations going through. We will continue to monitor those and then provide any updates and any kind of commentary on any of the developments that ensue. All right, moving on now to our warning items for the day. Robert, we have talked a lot about the Trump resistance. We've talked about how some of the elements that are resisting Trump aren't just partisan in nature. They don't just belong to maybe the opposition party, the Democratic Party, but we're seeing a lot of resistance from within the actual administration as well. And Mike, I'm going to pull you up on here actually to talk to us a little bit about this. So as we understand it, the Trump administration has been engaging in a very aggressive effort to reform the federal bureaucracy. As we mentioned before, this is a major component of the Trump resistance 2.0 that we've talked a lot about. What's going on there? What's Trump's strategy? What do we expect to see in coming days?
Yeah, this was Robert's item from yesterday. So before I start, I would just say, kind of at a big picture level, has anyone else noticed after the election, a lot of the talk about civil war and revolution and political violence, organized political violence has really cooled off? I've noticed that. My concern is that trend may be reversing here, because we've seen some of the reactions from Democrats over this. This is, I think they see this as an existential threat, and they should, because it is existential. So this is the most significant development that I've seen since 2020. You can read the full details in this morning's report, but I'll hit the highlights here. So yesterday, OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, directed federal agencies to pause all federal grants and loans. I'm sure you've heard about this by now. And they want to have these agencies go through these with a fine-tooth comb and make sure that money towards left-wing NGOs and left-wing causes end. This matters because Michael Anton, he's a former Trump national security staffer. He's running policy over at OMB. And so I started looking a little bit more into this. And there's a book called The Stakes. And it's a great book. I read it back in 2020, but I started searching through there and I said, well, okay, what did Michael Anton say about this? And sure enough, he describes in this book how left-wing elites, he says, quote, augment, entrench, and perpetuate their privilege and power, really through the use of federal government, federal money through these grants, which is taxpayer money. And so he proposes in this book the destruction of the existing establishment elite and the creation of a new elite. And he says conservatives have to reclaim cultural power. And he called for an alternative culture within, but against the regime, within the belly of the beast, but indigestible by it. That's a quote from the book. Again, a fantastic book. So Anton also in this book describes how taxpayer-derived federal funding fuels these left-wing social programs. He says that those are the things that ultimately must be disrupted and destroyed. And that is what he's trying to do here with this OMB pause. These things also appear in Mandate for Leadership, aka Project 2025. They call for, quote, cutting off taxpayer funding to entities that promote woke ideologies. And they say that should be a priority for the Trump administration. So a federal judge yesterday afternoon ruled that this OMB pause was unconstitutional. And so Robert said, and I think he's right, Robert said that the Trump administration will probably want to escalate this case to the Supreme Court to get a decision on the constitutionality of the Impoundment Control Act. That was an act passed in 1974. The Trump team says it's probably unconstitutional. And so a Supreme Court case potentially could rule that the president does have the authority to pause spending appropriated by Congress. Now, this legality of this OMB pause, which again is really part of the Trump political revolution under Project 2025, does remain in legal limbo. I really don't have any insight into how the Supreme Court might rule. But obviously, if it's a partisan ruling along partisan lines, it's going to be a big problem because a lot of folks on the left have already characterized the Supreme Court as being illegitimate. But Anton is very clear here in his previous writings that this is an imperative for the deconstruction of the existing elite in order to form a new elite. And so for their part, progressive activists and NGOs have also been very clear that their strategy is to fracture the MAGA coalition. So we're already starting to see, I think Maxwell Frost, he's a representative from Florida, started pushing an all call for mass mobilization. He says, look, we have to go protest against this. We may not see protests initially because this a federal judge did block this OMB pause. However, if this were to go through, it has potentially catastrophic implications here. And I'll just go through those here briefly. The left really should be looking at this as an existential threat, because you go back and you read all this writing, and this is exactly what they're talking about. Disrupting the flow of funds to these left-wing causes and these left-wing NGOs. And so, I look at this not simply as political warfare. I mean, this really is an intra-elite conflict, because what's happening here is this is a battle over control of state resources and cultural institutions. And control of state resources and cultural institutions have previously been captured by the left. And when you see Michael Anton and the Trump administration right now trying to recapture that. So this is really an attempt to end the status quo of establishment dominance in U.S. politics. Every single president, except for Trump, every single president, Democrat or Republican, has been a member of the go along to get along establishment. That is what they're trying to disrupt and ultimately destroy. Because again, Michael Anton is very clear. This is the first step towards creating a new political elite. And again, this is important because intra-elite conflict, which we're seeing now, historically leads to civil war and state breakdown, because one side attacks the side with the monopoly on power. And then if you have a monopoly on power, you're going to attack back. This is an existential threat. And we see this both in the French Revolution and in the lead up to the English Civil War, where you have this counter-elite faction that's attacking the elite's monopoly on power, and that leads to armed conflict. Historically, it does. We can also look in the late Roman Republic and in Weimar Germany, where the elite's use of state power to enrich themselves and to use it for partisan advantage really accelerated that fragmentation. The Roman Senates, for instance, the Roman Senate, they used prosecutions and violence against their opponents, while Roman elites began recruiting their own private armies. And then in the Weimar Republic, you have these right-wing death squads known as the Free Corps. They essentially received state protection while attacking these socialist and communist paramilitary uprisings. I don't know if it will get that bad, but this is clearly the risk here. The only other point I'll make here, and then I'll turn it back over to you, Mark, is if Anton and OMB are successful, these progressive NGOs will almost certainly see a funding shortfall. And so we're going to see layoffs, reduction in services and employment. We're going to see left-wing organizing capability also diminish. Their ability to build influence through providing social services, which again are taxpayer funded, will also be diminished. So these federal grants and programs really are the lifeblood of these left-wing NGOs. So the progressive establishment is going to see this as an existential crisis. They should. And I think that's why they're up in arms. One of the many reasons why they're up in arms. And so I do expect them, if this does go through to the Supreme Court and this OMB pause does stay, they're going to respond with institutional power of their own. That's almost certainly going to mean mass mobilization protests. I think what we saw in 2020 was an attempted popular revolution, and I'm concerned that we could see another 2020 style attempt under Trump.
Mike, I think The Stakes is also a really good book. Another one that I think fleshes out a lot of what we're seeing here is Peter Turchin's book, End Times. And he analyzes how a lot of these revolutionary transformations are brought on by this intra-elite competition and some of the wrangling that goes on in the background. And many of the cases historically that you brought up are kind of analyzed in that book as well. I think it's interesting, and I believe we've had a conversation about this, that Turchin said that the MAGA coalition, and this was back several years ago, really before it looked like Trump was going to win a second term, but he said that it could be possible that this movement that Trump is kind of at the head of, is that MAGA is the revolutionary party, as compared to his opposition, which is more of the establishment. And, in the past, the left has always characterized itself as a revolutionary element in American society. And I think that we've seen major political transformations brought on by the left as a revolutionary entity. But if that is true, and that we're seeing that this MAGA coalition is actually the revolutionary component, and now it has power, I do think it speaks to exactly what you're saying, is that this is going to drive an intra-elite competition for resources. And it looks like the Trump administration is seeing that exactly clearly by attacking the economic base, in a way, of his opposition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that book came out in 2022 or 23. He does say the Republican Party is the revolutionary party. Peter Turchin does. There's another book by the updated, The Fourth Turning is Here, by Neil Howe, and he essentially makes that same comparison. He actually says he believes a civil war. He says that something like the Irish Troubles, kind of low-scale political violence, is unlikely. He also thinks secession and national divorce is unlikely. He sees this, at least according to the book, he sees that we're headed straight towards a civil war. So there's a lot of academics. This is not just, folks on YouTube saying this. There's a lot of academics who are also pointing to this conflict, which we are now in the very beginning. We're in the first inning of this, I think.
Okay. And Mike, just for one, looking at perspective, I mean, you've looked at a lot of these groups before, and you've said before that they seem to be fairly exhausted. Do you see that changing with, I know that we've talked about deportations is going to be a major galvanizing force, but when it comes to maybe attacking the economic base of the establishment, I mean, do you think this could possibly change things, where we're seeing this really exhausted left, but this might actually be the galvanizing force we might have thought that deportations would be?
Yeah, this would have to be an all-out response. I mean, this really is an existential threat to these left-wing groups, the NGOs that have all this social and political power, that mobilize protests, that spend money on social services, spend our money on social services to build that social and political power. So this is that, we've talked about this before, the self-licking ice cream cone, where Democrats get into power, they create all these grant and spending programs for their social pet projects, and then their community organizers turn around and spend their political capital and also money to get more Democrats elected. And so this is kind of the revolving circle. This is something that really the right has not done. And we're finally kind of now seeing, I would say, an attempted fundamental transformation of the country on the right to counter. And the right, I think, really is a counter-revolutionary party. But this is the right, I think, the right's version of what Obama did to the federal government for 8 years.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Mike. Excellent commentary there. We'll continue to monitor this. But moving on to our next warning item, and this dovetails perfectly in with what we started off with. Robert, it looks like one of the efforts that the Trump administration has been pursuing in regards to the bureaucracy is it was just released, I guess, a news of a memo that will be circulated where the Office of Personnel Management will be offering to pay federal employees who do not want to return to the office full-time a paycheck through September as long as they resign by February. What's going on there?
Yeah, and included in this memo is also a direction to federal agencies to basically review and determine any employees that would be subject to President Trump's Schedule F executive order. So I think what's going on here is Trump is attempting to reshape the federal agencies to implement his agenda and removing, pro-Democrat and far-left federal employees that could undermine his agenda. We're already seeing some lawsuits here. One from the National Treasury Employee Union that filed a lawsuit against Trump's renewed Schedule F push. And I think there are other lawsuits likely to follow. I think this ties into the OMB push against cutting off money to far left NGOs and nonprofits, because federal employees are just looking at political partisan donation data, for example. Federal employees are a major power base for the Democratic Party. And a lot of these, they also support a lot of these NGOs. And I think this is likely to be a long-term fight for the Trump administration. And we're going to see a lot more lawsuits and pushback against this.
Yeah. And Robert, I'll just add one thing on this is that obviously I don't know exactly what inspired this, if this was a long-standing plan from the Trump administration. But I mean, we've seen this figure Curtis Yarvin pop up here and there in New York Times most recently, but also was interviewed on Tucker. And I mean, this has been something that he has argued many times before, and I imagine he has some influence with some political operators up in DC. But he had this idea called RAGE, Retire All Government Employees, and his idea was, instead of going in and trying to force people out, the best way is just to pay them off and have them leave and never enter federal service again. That this would be a lot more thorough and effective strategy in being able to tame the bureaucracy, so that a president, who might have some resistance to him, that he'd be able to actually fulfill his agenda throughout his term. I mean, do you see anything, similarities between some of those ideas there, Robert, or does this look like it's been a longstanding priority for the Trump administration?
Well, I do think this is coming from Yarvin. So yeah, he wrote about RAGE under under unqualified reservations, his blog that he wrote years ago. And I haven't seen anything explicit from any Trump officials saying that they had planned to do this, like this was a long-term plan. And this is a major change from how Trump approached reshaping the federal bureaucracy during his first term. So I think that this is a very heavy influence, just like Michael Anton is influencing making or having a significant influence in the OMB and how they're approaching the funding infrastructure for a lot of the far left and liberals. I think this is basically the second half of a strategy that's adopted from somebody in the administration is reading Yarvin or talking to him, because this is, I think, directly taken from that idea.
All right. Moving on. Now we have Robert. Also, it looks like we've had another potential assassination attempt on Trump or on his officials. It looks like there was an individual who's arrested who was targeting some Trump officials in DC. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, this was a man from Massachusetts. He had said that he had planned to assassinate either Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, House Speaker Mike Johnson, or Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. I think what's going on here is that so far the lack of a unified Trump resistance effort from Democrats and the far left is it combined with this, basically what's a policy blitzkrieg from the Trump administration in the first 2 weeks, has the potential to create kind of a cascading effect, because more of these self-radicalized individuals act, I think other radicalized or self-radicalized far left individuals kind of sitting on the sidelines will be moved to take action against Trump officials. And what leads me to believe that this wasn't necessarily an organized effort from far left organizations, that according to the police report, there was actually a note found on this individual when he was arrested, where it seems to point to this was maybe an attempt to suicide by cop, or like once he realized that the security details around these officials were very difficult to overcome. So I don't think there's any evidence so far this points to any kind of centralized organized effort. So I think this is more of a lone wolf type of attack or attempt, and I think that there's a potential we see more as more of these self-radicalized individuals, their threshold for action is reached by watching, as more people take more action, more people on the sidelines are going to decide it's their turn.
All right. Moving on to our next item, Robert. It looks like, according to sources familiar with ICE and their plans, federal authorities are now planning to conduct major immigration enforcement operations in 3 American cities per week that will include multiple government agencies. What's going on there?
Yeah, I think what's happening here is that the Trump administration started with deportations of illegal aliens who committed other crimes other than entering the country illegally, to kind of open the door for mass deportations, because I think ICE being told to ramp up routine enforcement majorly is a likely indicator the Trump administration is gearing up for mass deportations. I do think the outlook for this is, we're going to see this bolster some of this resistance from pro-immigrant and far-left activists. And we could see things like more protests and even possibly direct actions that we saw in things like the Stop Cop City, where activists targeted police vehicles with incendiary devices and some of these law enforcement vehicles and equipment.
All right. Thank you, Robert. All right, now let's shift over to our global portion of our warning items today. Jared, good morning. It looks like Poland's national defense minister just signed a deal yesterday to acquire over 200 anti-radiation missiles from the United States. Could you tell us a little bit more about this and why it matters?
Yes. So all of those missiles are set for delivery between 2029 and 2035. And as far as I can tell, published inventories of Poland's missiles don't actually include any anti-radiation missiles at all. And that's a key component to suppressing enemy air defense. So what this tells me is the late delivery and negotiations of this critical missile type, Poland is either completely uncommitted to suppressing enemy air defense in the next 5 years, or they don't believe they will need to do so until the 2030s. And this is actually contrary. This is evidence contrary to what many European and NATO officials are predicting for a war with Russia, which has been within the next 3 to 5 years and steadily decreasing.
All right. So, Robert, I'm not familiar with what anti-radiation missiles are, what they do. What's the significance of that specific type of missile?
Yep. So anti-radiation missiles are cheap, fast anti-radar missiles. And what they do is just run in, kill the radar, prevent you from launching surface-to-air missiles that would affect your ability to establish air dominance or to shoot down your ballistic missiles. Which all of that, if you're going to be on the front line like Poland is, you need to be able to do in the background of any potential war with Russia.
All right. Thanks, Jared. All right. For this next item, I want to bring Robert up as well. We're going to have a little bit of discussion here, but it looks like, Jared, that that the Mexican government is going to be finding ways to employ some of the deportees coming from the United States. What's going on there?
Yes. So this is coming from Armando Zuniga Salinas, the head of Asume. Asume is a multi-company group of 32 private security companies down in Mexico, and he said his group has 100,000 jobs waiting for deportees in the security sector in Mexico.
And so, okay. Oh yeah, go ahead, Jared.
Sorry. So I think it's important. I've seen some commentary on like, hey, there's some cartel connection here, but I think actually we can look to Africa for why the Mexican government might be putting some pressure on these security companies to create these jobs, because it's really common in African countries for their governments to take military age males who would otherwise be milling about and possibly creating problems, criminal problems or political problems, and send them overseas, either with private security companies, including in Iraq during the GWAT, there were private security companies with employees from Africa. And then, also send them on UN peacekeeping operations. It's a big thing for Pakistan and a lot of these other countries. So I think that's what's going on here is that, possibly behind the scenes, the Mexican government's like, okay, we're about to get a huge influx of military age males with these deportations. We need to do something about it because we can't have 100,000 military age males milling about, because that either means they look for jobs with the cartel or they're otherwise unemployed. And then they start creating criminal and political problems.
And so just to clarify here, is this a program under the Mexican government? Is this being supported by the Mexican government? Are we seeing the United States involving itself on with this particular effort to try to employ some of these deportees? Like, what does the official top cover look like for this type of operation?
I can actually step in here for that one. It's semi-governmental. Asume works with the Mexican government, but they're not technically part of it.
Okay. And Mike, do you have any insight on this as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, high youth unemployment is, I wouldn't say it's the death knell, but you see all these youth bulges, and that is an early warning indicator of civil strife, especially when they're unemployed. So we can look at all throughout history. And when you have lots of youth who are unemployed, nothing to do, they resort to criminality. They become a big problem for central governments. I'm sure that is a huge deal for Mexico City.
All right. Well, thank you, gents. All right. Well, that does it for today's early warning report. We did have one question I wanted to get to before we sign off for the day. For the remainder of the questions, we'll have to get to them during our roundtable. But Robert, we did have a question from one of our listeners saying, kind of taking issue with the idea of being some of these assassination attempts, like the most recent potential assassin of Trump officials. I think the listener took issue with the characterizing this person as being self-radicalized, given the rhetoric from some of the Democratic leaders and officials. What would be your response to that? What do you mean by self-radicalized?
Well, yeah, self-radicalized, it just means that they're not necessarily, there's not necessarily a Democratic Socialists of America cell that's politically educating, arming, and facilitating people to go out and commit attacks. And this is similar to ISIS and the idea of crystallization. Basically, these guys, they do consume this rhetoric. This type of rhetoric is put out, and these people consume it and decide that they're going to take action and do it on their own without any kind of central authority. And that's what I mean by self-radicalization.
All right. Thank you, Robert. Okay. Well, that does it for today's morning briefing. We really do appreciate you joining us. We'll be back tomorrow at 08 Central Time as usual. We'll also be getting to your questions on this week's roundtable, which will be this Friday at 10 Central Time. Please expect today's report in your inbox. We'll have the full report that will have our sit rep items. It will also have these warning items and others. And so you can expect that in your inbox later today. Well, thank you again for joining us. We appreciate all the support. And as always, stay out front.